Welcome to Game Plan. I'm Shivan now. So far, there is only one winner in this war in West Asia, and that's Russia. Mind you, I'm not saying that. This was acknowledged by the European Council President António Costa. U.S. Israeli strikes in West Asia, they have driven up the price of oil, strengthening the Kremlin's ability to fund its military campaign. Now, in a sharp reversal from last year's policy of penalizing countries for buying Russian energy, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the United States could unsanction other Russian oil to keep the flow of oil intact. And this is because the Strait of Hormuz, the pivotal point from where this war is kind of converging, that is under complete Iranian control. Movement of ships has been blocked, movement of oil has been blocked. It has shot up the oil prices, and the repercussions are being felt across the world at this point. Is the Iran war proving to be a boon for Russia, whose economy is dependent on energy exports? As the Strait of Hormuz gets blocked, Russia gets a free hand at selling its oil at rates that can be expounded without proper discounts as well. Is Putin the one winning in the war that US and Israel started against Iran? To discuss this with me on Game Plan is Dr. Diesen, Professor of International Relations at the University of South-Eastern Norway. Glenn, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much for joining me here. Trump and Putin, they held a call recently, the first time this year, and this was to discuss the ongoing hostilities in Iran. What do you think they would have discussed, and what kind of a role can Putin be playing in the ongoing war?
Well, I assume some of the things they discussed was obviously the extent to which the US and Russia targets each other, because one of the things that the American media has been complaining about is the likelihood that Russia is providing intelligence to Iran for targets. But of course, this is what the United States has been doing for years and continues to do. That is, give the Ukrainians targets to hit Russia. So you know, I think there's a necessity to begin to discuss what is appropriate. And again, what happens behind these doors, I don't know. But also, of course, there has to be some scaling back of the energy sanctions against Russia to bring this the energy prices under control. As you suggest, they are now very much out of control. But I think also the main thing they've discussed is how to bring this war to an end, because I think it's perfectly clear now that this US attack on Iran was a terrible mistake. And it appears that Putin would be the main middleman who might be able to bring an end to this war. But again, it depends what can be done, as what the Iranians will demand may be more than what the Americans can deliver.
Glenn, as you mentioned, Putin could perhaps be the main person to bring peace in this war. Putin has the highest chance of acting as peacemaker in West Asia. Is there anyone other than Putin at this point who can bring, because just look at the optics of it, US starts a war, and I think 10 days into it, he needs to make a call to Vladimir Putin to discuss that same war. How does it look for the US?
Well, they don't care for this, of course, but it's similar to what happened with the war against Syria. That is, if you remember back at President Obama's time, he had set these red lines. He were going to attack Syria. It was quite obvious that this would be a disaster. So he went to the Russian president, and he was able to get a deal through, and which essentially took Obama's chestnuts out of the fire. So it was, you know, it is the reality. The optics of it isn't great, given that the U.S. has been fighting a proxy war for years against Russia. But you know, at some point you have to put the optics aside. Who else would be in a position to help to negotiate this? I'm thinking, you know, perhaps China could be a middleman, but I think given that the United States, especially under the Trump administration, wants to improve bilateral ties with Russia, I think it's probably the best bet.
Would it be fair to say that Putin is emerging as a winner in this ongoing West Asia war, which only seems to be expanding within the West Asian region?
Well, no, I think, to a large extent, I think that is correct, because the energy prices are way up. The U.S. have to scale back sanctions. All the weapons which the U.S. had intended to ship towards Ukraine to fight Russia is now being depleted. For European leaders, as you mentioned earlier on, who aspire to prolong the war in Ukraine, this is an absolute disaster. And we'll see that countries that cut the energy ties, or at least reduced energy ties with Russia, at the behest of American pressure, they of course have learned a lesson now as well, that this was not a good idea, that you don't necessarily bet too much on a hegemon in decline. So countries who before paid discounts now may have to pay premium. We also see that Iran, which I assume is getting some support from Russia, sees this relationship improving dramatically. They're moving much closer, which is good for Russia, because the Iranians always have some suspicions towards the Russians, given a long history they've had through the centuries of conflict. So all of this improves. You can also say that the Gulf states, the weakening of the Gulf states has also a big impact on weakening the U.S. ability to restore its hegemony, because what's obvious now is that the Gulf states are not getting protection. Instead, they're becoming very vulnerable as frontline states, and the U.S. is no longer seen as that reliable. Well, if they're not going to bet their security on the United States anymore, then they may not have that much pressure to sell their oil in dollars. You're not going to have those recycled petrodollars coming back to the U.S., and suddenly the whole AI race with China looks a lot weaker as well. So I think across the board, a lot of things look good for Russia. But, and there is a big but here, and that is, I don't think that the Russians want this war nonetheless, because the Russians, much like the Chinese, value stability and predictability. And what's happening in Iran now could, again, if something would happen to Iran collapse, that would be a disaster for this greater Eurasia initiative, that is to integrate the economies of greater Eurasian continent. But also this could spiral into a world war. So, from this perspective, it's very dangerous, and I don't doubt that the Russians therefore want to put an end to this war. Simply because, I guess much like India, they don't want the Eurasian continent to be too China-centric. They would like to have many poles of power, and this requires diversification. This means that the Russians need close ties with Iran, with India, and other countries. So for the Americans to knock off Iran off the chessboard, the greater Eurasian chessboard, would be a disaster for the Russians. So yes, I think they're prospering or benefiting from this, but they do want to put an end to it.
Understood. Glenn, let me just come to the Strait of Hormuz. The objectives of US behind starting this war, that has been questioned enough. Why did you start this war in the first place? Those are questions not just emerging, globally, they're also emerging from inside the US. But if you look at what a win will actually look like for US, would it be the Strait of Hormuz? Like, with whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz is eventually who walks away walks away with the victory at this point, because the US was looking for a change in regime. They mentioned it enough number of times. That hasn't happened and doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Is the Strait of Hormuz the winning factor now?
Well, I don't think the US would be in a position to control this, just given the geography. So the US obviously went into this war with the objective of regime change. That was the goal. This was the decapitation strike. This was the hope of killing Khamenei. And obviously it didn't work. I think it shouldn't have come as a surprise, but killing the leader of Iran only created more solidarity within the country. And also the idea that the whole armed forces would begin to disintegrate once they had been punished enough, also proven to be incorrect. So I think at the moment you see the American pivoting a bit. Some are talking about the Strait of Hormuz, that this should be a goal. Others are saying, you see a shift now towards saying, well, actually what we really want to do is just degrade Iran's missile capabilities, that they won't have these long-range missiles. And again, these are the kind of vague objectives, which they can essentially declare victory today then, because Iran has had many of its missiles destroyed. Also, it launched a lot of its missiles at US targets, which means that its missile stockpile has been reduced. So, this should be a source of optimism when the US moves from this very hardline objective, such as regime change, and they shift in towards missiles, reducing the missile stockpiles or something like this. But the Strait of Hormuz, I think, is beyond what is reasonable. It will be too difficult. So I don't think they will push too hard on this.
Why do you feel it would be difficult? If I were to just look at the bases that they have across West Asia, they have enough military might, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, they have their bases there. How difficult would it be to exert that military might over the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, controlling it just means the ability to shut it down. Many countries would have the ability to shut down this narrow strait. The problem is that no one benefits from it. That is, the Gulf states are hurt. Iran is hurt from it. The US and the global economy is hurt. So it becomes an exercise in self-harm. The reason why the Iranians are doing this, the ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, is because the US has the ability to inflict a mass amount of destruction. It can, go after civilian infrastructure. It can, look what they've done to Tehran. It looks like, the chemical warfare there. You've seen in terms of going after his fuel depots, going after the water supplies in Iran. You see all these things. This is what America can do. Iran doesn't have that ability. They can't hit the United States. What they can do is cause economic pain. So yes, I think the US and many of the Gulf states can also shut down the Strait of Hormuz, but that's not, it doesn't have any purpose. It doesn't have any reasoning.
Can they eradicate the Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz? I'm not talking about shutting it down, but just get rid of the Iranians from there, and they then decide who gets to control and when it has to be shut and when it has to be opened and remain and kept open and secure it. Can the US exert that kind of military might over the Strait of Hormuz to control it?
Then one needs to control a massive amount of Iran's territory, which is a huge territory, populated by 90 million people. So this seems very unlikely. And if closing down the Strait of Hormuz would depend on very sophisticated weapon systems, it would be one thing. But this can be shut down with drones, which can be manufactured in apartments. It can be also shut down with small naval drones. That is this essentially drone-operated small torpedoes. It doesn't require a lot of high technology, which means that the US can't take out very key infrastructure to prevent Iran from shutting this down, to force it to open. But with very cheap and easy to make weapons, the Iranians can shut it down, and it's simply too much territory, too large population for the United States to shut down these capabilities. So at some point they're gonna have to make peace with the Iranians and make sure it's in Iran's interest to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, because it is in their interest. The problem now is that Iran faces an existential threat. That is, the US now threatens to destroy not just the government, but also the country. As Trump tweeted, we will make it impossible for Iran to even rebuild as a nation. And this is what regime change means. There is no replacement government. This means the disintegration and destruction of Iran, a massive civil war, which could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. So for them, this is existential, which is why they went to this great extent. They've never done this before, because they never believed that they faced this kind of an existential threat. So if the war ends, the Iranians have no reason to shut this strait down. This is very horrible for them as well. So no, I don't think the US can control the Strait of Hormuz. No one can control it completely, because too many actors could shut it down.
Glenn, thanks so much for joining me here on Game Plan. Whether this war continues further, that only means, and if it does, that's essentially what Iran is looking at, because they're not capitulating, they're not giving up. They are taking a bad amount of beating, there's no doubt in that, but they are continuing with their counters nevertheless. And Strait of Hormuz is their main play, where they're exerting their pressure with whether it's mines, whether it's their own boats, whether it's their own military boats. Now, energy experts have also warned that whether the Iran crisis proves a cure for Russia's economy, that depends directly on how long it lasts. But there is little to suggest that Iran is willing to capitulate, that what we just discussed. They're inviting US to continue the war, on the other hand. That's what the statements from Iran suggest, that we're waiting, come on. Now, in the midst of this, Russia is emerging as the winner, as we just discussed. How long this lasts, it doesn't seem to be in the favor of the US. We'll need to wait and watch. 12th day and running. They expected it to last for about 4 to 5 weeks. Whether it goes the distance or even longer, let's wait. That was Glenn Diesen joining me here on Game Plan.
Thanks, Shivan.